The dust devil swirled down Main Street of Bitter Creek like a warning from God himself. The town was dying, crops withered, cattle bones bleached white in the merciless sun, and hope had packed up and left with the last good rain 6 months ago. That's when Jake Morrison rode into town, his weathered face telling stories he'd never spoken aloud. The mare collapsed right there in front of the general store, ribs showing through patchy hide, eyes rolling back in defeat. Most folks would have put her down, but Jake wasn't most folks. What the townspeople didn't know was that this quiet drifter had once been Dr. Jacob Morrison, the finest veterinarian in 3 states, before tragedy drove him to abandon everything he'd ever loved. As Jake knelt beside the dying horse, pulling supplies from his saddlebags that no ordinary cowboy would carry, the gathered crowd held their breath. The stakes weren't just one horse's life. This broken-down animal somehow represented every dying dream in Bitter Creek. But what was it about this particular horse that made Jake's hands shake as he worked? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jake's calloused fingers traced the mare's neck, feeling for a pulse that barely whispered beneath the surface. The brand on her flank was faded but unmistakable, a circle with an arrow pointing east, his breath caught in his throat. He'd seen that mark before, burned into his memory like a scar that refused to heal. "Mister, you best step away from there," called out Sheriff Tom Bradley, emerging from the shade of the store's awning. "That horse is done for. Been wandering the desert for days, near as we can tell." Jake didn't look up. His hands moved with practiced precision, withdrawing a leather roll of instruments that glinted in the harsh sunlight. The crowd murmured among themselves. Cowboys didn't carry surgical tools. Where'd she come from? Jake's voice was gravelly from months of speaking only to his own horse and the wind. "Nobody knows," said Martha Henley, the store owner. "Just showed up this morning, stumbling like she was drunk. Poor thing's been circling the water trough, too weak to drink." Jake's jaw tightened. He knew exactly where she'd come from. The Eastwood Ranch had been 3 days' ride from here, back when it still existed. Back when Sarah had bred the finest quarter horses in the territory. Before the fire, before everything went to hell. This mare was one of Sarah's bloodline. He could tell by the delicate bone structure, the intelligent eyes that still held fight despite the body's surrender. Sarah had always said her horses carried something special, a spirit that refused to break, even when everything else did. "She's pregnant," Jake announced quietly, his hand resting on the mare's swollen belly. The crowd pressed closer. In a town where death had become commonplace, new life was nothing short of miraculous. "How can you tell?" asked young Billy Henderson, whose family had lost their farm 2 months back. Jake's hands continued their examination, checking hydration, listening to heart rate, assessing the foal's position. Experience. It was all the explanation he offered. He reached into his saddlebags again, producing a canvas water bag and a clean cloth. With gentle movements, he began dripping water onto the mare's tongue, coaxing her to swallow. Then he mixed something, powder from a small vial, into a wooden cup. "Electrolytes," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Dehydration's the biggest killer in cases like this." Sheriff Bradley scratched his head. "You talk like you've done this before." Jake's hands never stopped moving. He was checking the mare's gums, her temperature, the way her breathing shifted when he pressed certain spots on her ribs. Every creature deserves a chance. As he worked, more townspeople gathered. The blacksmith, Henry Walsh, left his forge. The schoolteacher, Miss Catherine Powell, brought her students out to watch. Even old Pete Murphy, who hadn't left his porch in months, hobbled over with his walking stick. They formed a circle around the man and the dying horse, their faces etched with something they'd almost forgotten how to feel. Not quite hope. That was too dangerous in a place like Bitter Creek. But something close to it, something that made their chests tight and their eyes bright. Jake produced a large syringe and filled it with clear liquid from a small bottle. "This might sting a little girl," he whispered, finding the vein in her neck with ease. The mare's eyes fluttered. Her breathing grew less labored. After several minutes that felt like hours, she lifted her head slightly. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. "Well, I'll be damned," breathed the sheriff. Jake finally looked up, meeting the eyes of the townspeople for the first time since he'd arrived. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, but there was something there that hadn't been present before, a flicker of the man he used to be. The morning sun had barely crested the mesa when Sarah Chen stepped onto the porch of her boarding house, already feeling the heat press against her face like an unwelcome hand. She'd been awake since before dawn, listening to the wind rattle the loose shutters and wondering if today would bring news of rain. The weathered planks beneath her feet creaked as she made her way to the water barrel, hoping against hope that yesterday's meager collection had somehow multiplied overnight. It hadn't. She dipped her tin cup into the shallow pool remaining at the bottom, careful not to disturb the sediment that had settled there. 3 sips. That's all she allowed herself before duty called her toward the stable where her guests' horses waited. The animals had been restless all night, and she couldn't blame them. When water was scarce, everyone suffered, man and beast alike. As she approached the weathered structure, voices carried on the still air, male voices, hushed but urgent, coming from behind the building. Sarah paused, her hand resting on the stable door's rusted handle. In a town where strangers were rare and secrets rarer still, unexpected conversations demanded attention. "I'm telling you, Marcus, I seen him before." The voice belonged to Jim Hartwell, the telegraph operator whose loose tongue had gotten him in trouble more times than she could count. Maybe 10, 12 years back. Different name then, but it's the same man. "You sure about that?" Marcus Webb's gravelly response carried the authority of someone accustomed to being believed. As the town's self-appointed leader in the absence of any real law, his word carried weight that even doubt couldn't shake. "Course I'm sure. Man doesn't forget a face like that. Scars tell stories, Marcus, and his story ain't one you'd want your daughter hearing." Sarah pressed closer to the wall, her heart quickening. They had to be talking about the stranger, the man who'd appeared yesterday evening like a ghost materializing from the heat's shimmer. She'd given him a room, grateful for the payment he'd offered in advance, but she hadn't pressed for details. In her experience, men who paid in gold coins and asked no questions expected the same courtesy in return. What name did he use before? Marcus's voice had dropped even lower, forcing Sarah to strain her ears. Called himself Thomas Blackwood then. Was wanted for gentlemen. The new voice cut through their conversation like a blade through silk, smooth and quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Sarah's breath caught. The stranger had found them, or perhaps they'd found him. Either way, the sudden silence that followed his words spoke volumes about the tension now crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. "Just having a friendly conversation," Jim stammered, his bravado evaporating like water on hot stone. "I'm sure you were." There was something in the stranger's tone that made Sarah's skin prickle. Not threatening exactly, but weighted with the kind of certainty that came from a man who'd faced down worse things than small-town gossip. The thing about conversations, though, is that sometimes they can lead to misunderstandings. And misunderstandings, well, they have a way of causing unnecessary trouble. "You threatening us, mister?" Marcus had found his voice again, though it lacked its usual commanding tone. Threatening? No. Just observing that in a town dealing with drought, people might have better uses for their time than digging up old stories that may or may not be true. Sarah heard footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking away, but she couldn't tell who without risking discovery. "This conversation ain't over," Marcus called out, his words carrying the hollow ring of a man trying to save face. "I imagine not," came the stranger's reply, already growing distant. "But perhaps next time you'll remember that actions speak louder than words. And right now, this town needs more action and less talk." The sound of boots on hard-pan earth continued until it faded entirely, leaving only the whisper of wind through the stable's gaps and the nervous shuffle of horses inside. Sarah waited several heartbeats before easing away from the wall, her mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. She'd seen enough of the world to know that men carried their pasts like invisible burdens, some heavier than others. The stranger, whatever his real name might be, had shown nothing but courtesy since his arrival. He'd paid for his room, helped with her sick mare, and asked for nothing beyond basic hospitality. But Jim Hartwell's memory was notoriously sharp when it came to faces, and Marcus Webb didn't make accusations lightly. If they were right about the stranger's identity, if he truly was this Thomas Blackwood they spoke of, then Hope's End might be harboring more than just another drifter seeking shelter from the unforgiving sun. Sarah pushed open the stable door, stepping into the dim interior where dust motes danced in shafts of golden light. Whatever truth lay buried in the stranger's past would surface eventually. In a town this small, secrets had a way of revealing themselves whether folks wanted them to or not. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Thomas made his way to the livery stable, a canvas sack of grain slung over his shoulder. Word had spread quickly through Salvation Creek about the stranger and the dying horse, and curiosity gnawed at him like a persistent itch. As the town's only blacksmith, he'd seen his share of suffering animals during this endless drought, but something about yesterday's events felt different. The stable doors stood open, allowing what little breeze existed to flow through the dim interior. Thomas paused at the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the shadows. There, in the far stall, stood a sight that made him question his own vision. The horse, the same skeletal creature he'd watched collapse in the street, lifted its head at his approach. Its coat, while still dull, no longer hung loose over protruding ribs. The animal's eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there the day before, and when it shifted its weight, Thomas noticed it no longer favored its injured leg. Remarkable, isn't it? Thomas spun around to find the drifter emerging from another stall, hay dust clinging to his dark clothes. Up close, the stranger appeared younger than Thomas had first thought, perhaps 35, with weathered hands that spoke of hard labor and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "I've never seen anything like it," Thomas admitted, setting down his grain sack. "Yesterday, I would have sworn that horse wouldn't see another sunrise." The drifter approached the stall, running his hand along the horse's neck with practiced familiarity. Animals have a stronger will to live than most people give them credit for. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in that will. "And water," Thomas added pointedly. "Lots of water." A ghost of a smile crossed the stranger's face. "Yes, water helps." Thomas studied the man carefully. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I smith for the town, and I've been around horses my entire life. What you did yesterday, that wasn't just good care and clean water." "Ezra," the drifter replied, offering his name but nothing more. "And sometimes good care is more powerful than people realize." Before Thomas could press further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the stable. Martha Clearwater appeared in the doorway, her usual stern expression replaced by something closer to wonder. Behind her trailed young Billy Morrison, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Mrs. Clearwater," Ezra nodded respectfully. She approached the stall with measured steps, her gaze fixed on the horse. "I came to see for myself." Her voice carried a tremor that betrayed her usual composure. "In 40 years of living in this town, I've never witnessed such a recovery." Billy pressed against the stall door, his small hands gripping the weathered wood. "Mister, how did you fix him? Is it magic?" Martha shot the boy a sharp look, but Ezra chuckled softly. "No magic, son. Just patience and knowing where to look for what's needed." "But where did you find the water?" Thomas pressed. "We've sent scouts 20 miles in every direction. Every stream, every spring, they're all dried up." Ezra's hand stilled on the horse's neck. For a moment, the only sound in the stable was the soft shuffle of hooves on straw. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to settle over them all. "Sometimes, What we're looking for is closer than we think." Martha stepped closer, her sharp eyes fixed on the stranger's face. "You're not just talking about water, are you?" Before Ezra could answer, the stable filled with new voices. Doc Henley entered alongside Mayor Patterson, both men wearing expressions of barely contained amazement. Behind them came Sarah Mitchell, her infant daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Ezra," Doc Henley said, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand, "I've examined this horse thoroughly. What I'm seeing defies medical explanation." Mayor Patterson mopped his brow with a handkerchief despite the early hour. "The whole town's talking about it. People are saying you performed a miracle." Ezra shifted uncomfortably under their collective gaze. "I simply gave a suffering creature what it needed to heal itself." "But the water," Sarah spoke up, her voice soft but insistent. "My husband checked the well at the old Henderson place where you were seen. It's been dry for 2 years. The group fell silent, waiting. Ezra looked around at their faces, hopeful, desperate, searching. He moved away from the horse and walked to the stable's open doors, gazing out at the drought-ravaged landscape. "Tell me," he said finally, "what do you see when you look at your town?" "Dust," Billy piped up honestly. "Lots and lots of dust." "Death," Martha added grimly. "Everything dying or already dead." Ezra nodded slowly. "And what if I told you that beneath all that dust and death, life is still waiting? That the answer to your town's salvation has been here all along, buried not in the ground, but in something far more accessible?" He turned back to face them, and Thomas noticed something different in the stranger's eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. "Would you be willing to dig for it?" The dawn came slow and reluctant over Millbrook, painting the parched earth in shades of amber and rust. Elias was already up, kneeling beside the mare in the makeshift shelter he'd constructed behind the general store. Her breathing had steadied through the night, and though she was still weak, her eyes held a spark that hadn't been there the day before. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Doc Harrison, approaching with his leather medical bag. The old physician had insisted on checking the horse, despite his usual practice being limited to the town's human inhabitants. "She's actually responding." Elias looked up from where he'd been gently massaging the mare's legs. "Animals want to live just as much as we do. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them." Doc Harrison knelt beside the horse, running practiced hands along her neck and flanks. "What exactly did you give her yesterday?" "That wasn't any ordinary remedy." For a moment, Elias hesitated. The secret he carried wasn't one he shared lightly, but something in the old doctor's eyes. A genuine concern that went beyond mere curiosity made him consider it. "My grandmother was what some folks might call a healer," Elias said carefully. "She taught me things about plants, about the old ways. That mixture, it's something that's been in my family for generations." The doctor nodded slowly. "I've seen a lot in my years, son. Seen things that medical books can't explain. Whatever you did, it's working." Word of the mayor's improvement spread through Millbrook faster than wildfire. By mid-morning, a steady stream of townspeople had found excuses to walk past the general store, stealing glances at the horse that everyone had written off as dead. Sarah Jenkins brought fresh water in her good bucket, the one she usually reserved for drinking. Tom Bradley, the bank manager known for his rigid adherence to rules and regulations, quietly left a bundle of hay without saying a word to anyone. "Folks are talking," Sheriff Williams told Elias as they watched the mayor take tentative steps around the small enclosure. "Haven't seen the town this interested in anything for months." Elias adjusted his hat against the climbing sun. "Sometimes hope is contagious." "That what this is? Hope?" The sheriff's weathered face creased with something between skepticism and longing. "What else would you call it?" Before the sheriff could answer, a commotion erupted from the direction of the main street. Raised voices carried on the dry air, and both men turned to see a crowd gathering near the town well. "Trouble," Williams muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. They arrived to find Marcus Stone, the largest landowner in the county, facing off against several of the smaller ranchers. Stone's expensive boots and tailored clothes marked him as different from the dust-covered locals, and his face was red with anger. "You people are delusional if you think some drifter playing veterinarian changes anything," Stone was saying, his voice carrying across the square. "This drought is going to break every one of you, and when it does, I'll be here to buy your land for what it's actually worth." "Maybe so," said Pete Morrison, a rancher whose spread bordered Stone's vast holdings, "but at least we're not giving up without a fight." Stone's laugh was harsh. "Fight? You call wasting water on a dying horse fighting? That stranger is filling your heads with false hope, and it's going to cost you everything." Elias stepped forward, his movement calm but deliberate. The crowd parted slightly, and Stone's attention fixed on him with obvious hostility. "Mr. Stone, isn't it?" Elias said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "I know exactly who you are," Stone replied, his eyes narrowing. "You're a troublemaker. A man who shows up and starts giving people ideas above their station. Ideas like compassion, like not giving up when things get difficult." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Several hands had moved closer to gun belts, and Sheriff Williams positioned himself where he could intervene quickly if needed. Stone stepped closer to Elias, close enough that his voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow everyone could still hear. "I've spent years building my position in this county. I won't have some nobody with a bag of folk remedies undermining what I've worked for. Pack up and move on, friend, while you still can." Elias met Stone's glare without flinching. "I appreciate the advice, but I think I'll stay a while longer. The mayor isn't fully recovered yet, and I like to finish what I start." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, the only sound the whisper of wind through the dry buildings. Then Stone stepped back, his smile cold and calculating. "Suit yourself," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." As Stone strode away, the crowd began to disperse, but the tension remained. Elias could feel it in the sidelong glances, in the way conversations stopped when he approached. The battle lines were being drawn, and somehow a dying horse had become the symbol around which the entire conflict would turn. The morning sun painted the dusty main street in shades of amber and gold as Ezra made his way toward the old church at the far end of town. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook about the stranger's success with Old Blue, and already a small crowd had gathered around the weathered building that had served as both sanctuary and community center for the better part of 2 decades. Sarah Chen walked beside him, her medical bag clutched tightly in one hand. She'd insisted on accompanying him after hearing about his request to examine the town's water sources, though she wasn't entirely sure why. There was something about the quiet drifter that commanded respect, a certainty in his movements that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for. "Most folks gave up on finding new water years ago," she said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The county sent engineers through here twice. Both times they left shaking their heads." Ezra nodded, but didn't reply immediately. His attention was focused on the landscape around them, taking in details that others might have overlooked. The way certain patches of earth held a slightly different color, how some of the struggling vegetation seemed to cluster in particular areas, the subtle variations in the terrain that spoke of water's ancient pathways. Mayor Henderson was waiting for them at the church steps, his usual bluster replaced by cautious hope. Behind him stood a handful of other townspeople, including Tom Bradley from the general store and Margaret Sullivan, the schoolteacher who'd taken it upon herself to document Millbrook's gradual decline in a series of letters to her sister back east. "Mr. Cole," Henderson began formally, then caught himself. "Ezra, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what you think you can find that others haven't already searched for, but after what you did for Old Blue yesterday—" He trailed off, gesturing helplessly. "Sometimes fresh eyes see what familiar ones miss," Ezra replied simply. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket, a rough map he'd sketched the night before while camping just outside town. "I'd like to start with the old cemetery behind the church, then work our way toward the creek bed." Margaret Sullivan stepped forward, curiosity overcoming her natural reserve. What exactly are you looking for? The engineers had all sorts of equipment, metal detectors, measuring devices I couldn't even pronounce. Ezra smiled slightly. Equipment's useful, but sometimes the land tells its own story if you know how to listen. He pointed toward the weathered headstones visible behind the church. Settlements were built where they were for reasons. Your founders chose this spot deliberately. As the group made their way around the building, Ezra began to move with purpose, examining the ground with an intensity that drew everyone's attention. He knelt beside several of the older graves, running his fingers through the soil, noting its composition and moisture content. "The earth here," he said, standing and brushing dirt from his hands, "it's different, darker, holds water better." He looked up at the assembled faces. "Your cemetery is built on what used to be a wetland." Tom Bradley scratched his graying beard. "That can't be right. This whole area's been dry as bone for as long as anyone can remember." "Above ground, yes," Ezra agreed, "but underground water doesn't always follow the same rules as what we can see." He began walking in a slow, deliberate pattern, occasionally stopping to examine the base of the old oak tree that provided shade for the cemetery, or to study the way rain runoff had carved tiny channels in the earth. Sarah watched him work with growing fascination. There was method to his movements, a systematic approach that spoke of knowledge gained through experience rather than formal education. "You've done this before," she observed. "Here and there," Ezra replied, pausing near a cluster of graves from the 1880s. "Water finds a way to leave signs, even when it's hiding." He pointed to a line of stones that marked the cemetery's eastern boundary. "See how those markers lean? Just slightly, all in the same direction." The group moved closer, squinting in the morning light. Sure enough, several of the older stones had shifted over the decades, tilting in a subtle but consistent pattern. "Ground's been settling," Margaret breathed, understanding dawning in her voice. "Settling because there's space below for it to settle into," Ezra confirmed. "And space below ground usually means one of two things. Either something was removed or something flowed away." He turned to face the group. "I think your water didn't disappear. I think it went underground, following a path that was always there but got blocked somewhere along the way." Mayor Henderson's face had gone pale with hope and fear in equal measure. "Are you saying there might still be water here?" Ezra looked out over the drought-stricken landscape, then back at the expectant faces surrounding him. "I'm saying there's only one way to find out for certain." He paused, letting the weight of possibility settle over them all. "But we're going to need shovels." The mare's breathing had steadied through the night, each rise and fall of her ribcage a small victory against the drought's relentless grip. Thomas knelt beside her in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands gentle as he checked the makeshift bandages around her legs. The cuts were healing cleaner than he'd expected, and the fever had broken some time before midnight. "She's a fighter," he murmured to himself, stroking the horse's neck. Her coat, though still dull from malnutrition, had lost that deathly pallor. The water he'd been giving her in careful portions seemed to be working its way through her system properly. Behind him, the sound of boots on packed earth announced Sarah's arrival. She carried a steaming cup of coffee and what appeared to be the last heel of bread from her kitchen. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, settling beside him. "How is she?" "Better. Much better than I thought possible." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the bitter warmth. Real coffee was becoming scarce in Millbrook, another casualty of the dried-up trade routes. Sarah broke the bread in half, offering him the larger piece. "The whole town's talking about what you did yesterday. Some folks are calling it impossible." Thomas chewed slowly, considering his words. "Nothing impossible about it, just took time and patience." "Time and patience don't usually bring half-dead horses back from the brink." Sarah's voice carried something between suspicion and hope. "Martha Hendricks swears her well started running clearer after you passed by her property yesterday evening." The coffee suddenly tasted too bitter. Thomas set the cup down carefully, his eyes fixed on the mare's steady breathing. "Wells do that sometimes. Underground streams shift. In the middle of a 3-year drought?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas had known this moment would come eventually. It always did. The small signs, the subtle changes that followed in his wake, they accumulated until people started asking questions he couldn't answer without revealing truths that would change everything. "People see what they want to see," he said finally, "especially when they're desperate." Sarah studied his profile in the growing light. "And what do you see?" Before Thomas could answer, the sound of running footsteps echoed through the stable yard. Young Billy Peterson burst through the doorway, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Miss Sarah, Mr. Thomas, you got to come see." The boy could barely catch his breath. "The creek! Something's happening to the creek!" Thomas felt his stomach drop. Sarah was already on her feet, following Billy toward the door. With a last glance at the recovering mare, Thomas reluctantly joined them. The morning sun painted Millbrook's dusty streets in shades of gold and amber. A growing crowd had gathered along Creek Road, pointing and murmuring at something beyond the town's eastern edge. Thomas could see Mayor Patterson's tall frame among the group, along with several other council members. As they approached the gathering, Thomas could hear the sound that had drawn everyone from their morning routines, the unmistakable whisper of running water. The crowd parted as Sarah approached, their respect for the town's unofficial leader evident in their deference. Thomas hung back, but Mayor Patterson spotted him immediately. "Thomas! There you are!" Patterson's voice boomed across the group. "You need to see this." Against every instinct screaming at him to turn away, Thomas moved through the crowd to the creek's edge. What he saw made his blood run cold. Bitter Creek, which had been nothing but cracked mud and scattered stones for over 2 years, now carried a thin but steady stream of clear water. Not much, barely enough to wet the bottom of the channel, but unmistakably real. The water caught the morning light like scattered diamonds, more precious than gold to the drought-stricken community. "Started about an hour ago," Patterson explained, his usual political composure cracked with genuine wonder. "Just a trickle at first, but it's been growing steadily." Old Doc Morrison knelt by the water's edge, cupping a handful to examine it closely. "It's clean," he announced, "cleaner than anything we've seen in years." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Some folks were already planning to spread the word to neighboring towns. Others debated whether to start planting again, daring to hope for crops that had seemed impossible just yesterday. Through it all, Thomas stood silent, watching the water flow past his boots. He knew what this meant, understood the forces at work better than anyone present could imagine. The gift that had driven him from town to town for more years than he cared to count was asserting itself again, responding to his presence whether he willed it or not. Sarah peered at his elbow, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Still think it's just people seeing what they want to see?" Thomas watched a leaf drift past on the tiny current, carrying with it the weight of decisions he'd hoped to avoid. The mare would recover, the creek was flowing, and soon, very soon, he'd have to choose between the truth and the road. "No," he said quietly, "I don't think that anymore." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as word spread through Salvation Creek like wildfire. Martha Henderson had been the first to notice, rushing from her boarding house with her apron still tied around her waist, calling out to anyone who would listen. By the time the church bell rang 6 times, half the town had gathered around the old well behind Jeremiah's blacksmith shop. Thomas knelt beside the weathered stone rim, his weathered hands cupped around his ear as he listened to the unmistakable sound echoing from the depths below. The rhythmic drip-drop-drip that had been absent for over 2 years now played like music in the morning air. "Sweet, merciful heaven," whispered Doc Patterson, removing his spectacles to clean them as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. The water level's risen at least 15 feet since yesterday. Samuel stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the faces around him transform from skepticism to wonder to something approaching reverence. Children pushed forward between their parents' legs, eager to peer into the dark depths where their pennies used to disappear into murky water instead of hitting dry stone. "It's that stranger," declared Mrs. Abernathy, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through 7 decades of prairie life. "Ever since he arrived with that dying horse, things have been different. Mark my words." "Now hold on," Samuel interjected, stepping forward. "Water doesn't just appear overnight because someone rides into town. There's got to be a logical explanation." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. He had checked this very well himself just 3 days ago, confirming what everyone already knew, that the drought had claimed yet another source of life from their struggling community. The timing was impossible to ignore, no matter how much his rational mind rebelled against the implications. Thomas stood slowly, his knees creaking with the effort. "Martha, fetch that old rope from behind the church. We need to lower a bucket and see just how much water we're talking about." As Martha hurried away, her skirts kicking up small clouds of dust, the crowd pressed closer. Even the most hardened skeptics found themselves holding their breath as Thomas prepared to test their hopes against reality. "Where is he?" asked young Billy Morrison, craning his neck to scan the assembled faces. "Where's the stranger?" The question rippled through the crowd, and Samuel realized that indeed the mysterious drifter was nowhere to be seen. Neither was the horse, the same animal that had been on death's doorstep just days ago and had somehow recovered with impossible speed. "Saw him heading toward the old Miller place before dawn," offered Pete Jenkins, the telegraph operator, "him and that sorrel mare of his, moving like they had purpose." Samuel felt an unexpected chill despite the climbing temperature. The Miller place had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the drought drove the family east toward better prospects. It sat on the highest hill overlooking the valley, a skeleton of broken dreams and sun-bleached timber. Martha returned with the rope, and Thomas quickly fashioned a slipknot to secure the metal bucket. The crowd fell silent as he began lowering it into the well's depths, the rope sliding through his calloused palms with practiced ease. The wait felt eternal until finally they heard the splash echoing up from below. When Thomas hauled up the bucket, it came heavy and full, clear water sloshing over the rim and darkening the parched earth at their feet. A collective gasp rose from the assembled townspeople, followed by an almost reverent silence. "That's got to be 30 gallons of draw at least," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Maybe more." Doc Patterson stepped forward and cupped his hands, accepting the water Thomas offered him. He drank deeply, then straightened with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "It's sweet," he whispered. "Clean and cold and sweet." The crowd erupted then, with children cheering and women weeping and men slapping each other on the back as if they had personally engineered this miracle. But Samuel found himself looking toward the distant hills, toward the Miller place where smoke was now rising from the abandoned chimney. As the celebration continued around the well, Samuel made a decision that surprised even him. He needed answers, and his instincts told him that the mysterious stranger held the key to understanding what was happening to their town. The transformation of the dying horse, the sudden appearance of water, the timing that defied all logic, it was too much to dismiss as mere coincidence. He slipped away from the crowd while they were still passing the bucket from hand to hand, each person taking their turn to drink from what many were already calling a miracle. The walk to the Miller place would take the better part of an hour, but Samuel had questions that demanded answers, no matter how unsettling those answers might prove to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Samuel knelt beside the water source he'd discovered in the canyon's depths. The spring bubbled up from a crack in the red sandstone, clear and cool despite the relentless heat that had plagued Millbrook for months. He cupped the water in his hands, tasting its sweetness, then sat back on his heels and closed his eyes. This wasn't just any spring. The familiar taste brought back memories he'd tried to bury for 15 years. Back in town, Sheriff Morrison was already organizing the men. Word had spread quickly about Samuel's discovery, and hope flickered in eyes that had grown accustomed to despair. Jeremiah Walsh stood at the front of the gathering crowd outside the general store, his voice carrying over the excited murmur. "We'll need rope, picks, "And every able-bodied man who can swing a shovel," Walsh declared. "If we can clear a path down that canyon and dig out the spring proper, we might have enough water to last through the drought." Martha emerged from the store with her ledger, already calculating supplies. The horse Samuel had saved stood in the shade nearby, its coat gleaming with renewed health. Children had taken to bringing it scraps and sugar cubes, treating the animal like a miracle made flesh. "How do we know this stranger's telling the truth?" asked Ezra Blackwood, the banker whose harsh policies had driven several families from their homes. "Could be leading us on a fool's errand." Old Pete spat into the dust. "That horse says otherwise. Man who can bring something back from death's door ain't likely to be spinning tales." As the debate continued, Samuel emerged from the canyon, his hat pulled low against the climbing sun. He moved with the quiet purpose they'd all grown to recognize, but something in his bearing had changed. The weight he carried seemed heavier now, more personal. "Spring's real enough," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "But there's something you all should know before you start digging." The crowd fell silent. Martha felt her heart quicken, recognizing the tone of a man about to reveal a burden long carried. Samuel's weathered hands worked at the brim of his hat. 15 years ago, I worked a claim up in these parts with my partner. We found that spring during our surveys, planned to use it for our mining operation." His voice grew quieter, but we got greedy. Started diverting water from the underground channel that feeds it, trying to wash more ore through our sluices. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "What happened?" "The whole system collapsed. Our interference caused a rockfall that blocked the main flow. We triggered the very drought that's been killing this land." Samuel's eyes found Martha's across the crowd. "My partner wanted to fix it, but I was young and stubborn. Said we should cut our losses and move on. So we did." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jeremiah Walsh's face darkened with understanding. "You're the reason our wells went dry, the reason we lost 3 harvests, the reason my Sarah—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew his wife had died 2 winters ago, worn down by the hardship of failed crops and mounting debts. "Yes," Samuel said simply, "I am." The crowd stirred like a disturbed anthill. Angry voices rose, but Samuel stood his ground, unflinching. "I can't undo what I did," he continued, "but I can fix it. The spring's flowing again because I've been working nights to clear the blockage. It'll take time to restore full flow to the underground channels, but it can be done. Will be done if you'll let me." Ezra Blackwood pushed forward, his face twisted with rage. "You've got some nerve showing up here, playing the hero after destroying our lives." "He saved the horse," Martha said suddenly, her voice carrying clear and strong. "He could have ridden through like every other drifter, but he didn't. He stopped. He stayed, because he knew Walsh accused. He knew what he'd done." Samuel nodded. "I did know. Been carrying the guilt for 15 years, drifting from place to place, never able to settle because of what I'd done here. When I saw that horse dying in the street, saw what this town had become." He paused, gathering himself. "Sometimes you find yourself in a place where you can finally make amends. This is mine." The crowd wrestled with his words. Here was their salvation and their destroyer, wrapped in the same weathered frame. The spring bubbled on in the canyon below, indifferent to human judgment, but crucial to human survival. Old Pete broke the tense silence. "Well, I'll be damned if I'm going to die of thirst on account of pride. You know how to fix this mess, stranger, then you'd better get to fixing it." One by one, others nodded agreement. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something more important, the recognition that survival sometimes required working alongside those who had wronged you. The real work was just beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Samuel watched the last of the water wagons disappear over the eastern ridge. 3 days had passed since the spring's discovery, and already the transformation was remarkable. Where once dust devils had danced through empty streets, children now played hopscotch on freshly swept boardwalks. The sound of hammers rang out from the old mercantile, as volunteers worked to repair the roof that had been damaged in the last windstorm. But it was the people themselves who had changed most dramatically. Mrs. Henderson, who hadn't spoken to her neighbor in 5 years over a property dispute, was now sharing fresh bread with the entire block. The banker, once feared for his ruthless foreclosures, had announced a moratorium on all outstanding debts until the harvest came in. Even old Pete, the town drunk, had sobered up enough to help dig irrigation channels. Samuel found himself both amazed and troubled by what he witnessed. He'd seen communities rally before, but never with such unified purpose. It was as if the spring had washed away more than just the drought. It had cleansed years of accumulated bitterness and suspicion. "You look like a man wrestling with his conscience," came a familiar voice behind him. Samuel turned to find Father Miguel approaching, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. The priest's eyes held a knowing glint that made Samuel uncomfortable. "Just observing," Samuel replied carefully. "Ah, but observation requires interpretation, does it not? And interpretation reveals the observer's heart." Father Miguel settled onto the bench beside him. "The people speak of you as if you were sent by Providence itself." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I'm just a drifter who found water, nothing more." "Is that what you tell yourself?" The priest's voice carried no judgment, only gentle curiosity. Strange how a simple drifter would know exactly where to find a spring that our best dowsers missed for decades. Stranger still how that same drifter carries himself like a man bearing the weight of old sins. The words hit closer to home than Samuel cared to admit. He'd spent 3 years running from his past, moving from town to town, never staying long enough for anyone to ask difficult questions. But something about this place, about these people, had made him linger. "We all carry weight, Father," Samuel said finally. "Indeed we do, but some weights are meant to be shared, not carried alone." Father Miguel pointed toward the center of town, where a group of men were installing a new pump over the spring. "You see how they work together now? That spring didn't just give them water, it gave them hope. But hope without foundation crumbles quickly." Samuel understood the implication. The priest was asking him to stay, to become the foundation upon which this newfound community spirit could rest. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man running from his past being asked to anchor someone else's future. "What if I'm not the man they think I am?" Samuel asked. "What if you're exactly the man they need you to be?" Before Samuel could respond, a commotion erupted near the spring. Raised voices carried across the square, and he could see 2 groups of men facing off. Their earlier cooperation dissolved into familiar antagonism. Samuel recognized the signs immediately. The fragile peace was fracturing. "The Cattlemen's Association says the spring belongs to them by virtue of their land holdings," Father Miguel explained as they hurried toward the disturbance. "The farmers claim equal rights, since their families were here first. Old divisions die hard, it seems." Samuel felt his stomach clench as he approached the crowd. Jim Morrison, the largest rancher in the county, stood toe-to-toe with Tom Anderson, whose small farm bordered the spring's location. Both men's faces were red with anger, their supporters forming ranks behind them. "My cattle have been drinking from this watershed for 20 years, Morrison declared. "I won't have it rationed out to every sod-busting fool who thinks he deserves an equal share." "Your cattle helped cause this drought in the first place," Anderson shot back. "Overgrazing, stripping the land bare. Maybe it's time the land served those who respect it." The crowd murmured agreement with whichever side they favored, the unity of recent days evaporating like morning mist. Samuel could see Mrs. Henderson backing away from neighbors who'd been sharing her bread just hours earlier. The children had stopped playing, sensing the adult tension that threatened to explode into something uglier. This was the moment Samuel had dreaded, when he'd have to choose between disappearing before the situation turned violent or stepping forward and risking exposure of truths he'd spent years hiding. The weight Father Miguel had spoken of seemed to double, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. But as he looked at the faces around him, hope turning to fear, community dissolving back into suspicion, Samuel realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. Some moments demanded everything a man had to give, regardless of the cost. He stepped into the circle between the two factions, his voice cutting through the rising anger like a blade through silk. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed landscape as Elena stood at her kitchen window, watching the impossible green shoots push through what had been barren earth just days before. The sight still took her breath away, even though she'd witnessed the miracle with her own eyes. Water flowed steadily through the irrigation channels Thomas had helped them dig, carrying life to every corner of their drought-ravaged valley. She could hear voices from the town square, excited chatter that had replaced the grim silence that once hung over Cedar Falls like a burial shroud. Children laughed as they splashed in the shallow pools Thomas had created for their enjoyment, their joy infectious even among the most hardened ranchers who had given up hope months ago. "Still can't believe it," her husband Miguel said, joining her at the window with 2 cups of coffee. "That man, where did he really come from?" Elena accepted the warm mug gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd been forcing down. The supply wagon had arrived yesterday, the first merchant willing to risk the journey to Cedar Falls in over 6 months. Word was spreading about their transformation. "Does it matter?" she replied, though the question had haunted her sleepless nights. Thomas moved through their community like a ghost made flesh, appearing wherever he was needed most, solving problems with an uncanny understanding of both land and human nature. He saved us. Through the window they watched Thomas emerge from the Hendersons' barn, old Star trotting beside him with the spirited gait of a horse half her age. The mare's recovery had been the first miracle, but far from the last. Thomas had somehow coaxed water from deep underground springs that seasoned well-diggers swore didn't exist, redesigned their irrigation system with an engineer's precision, and taught their failing crops to thrive again with techniques none of them had ever seen. "Pa, look!" Their daughter Maria came running into the kitchen, her dress muddy and her face glowing with excitement. She held up a handful of wildflower seeds. "Thomas showed us where to plant these. He says by next spring, the whole valley will be a carpet of colors." Miguel knelt down to examine the seeds, his weathered face creasing into a smile that had become more frequent with each passing day. "That sounds beautiful, mija. Did he teach you about the soil preparation?" "Oh, yes." Maria launched into an enthusiastic explanation of composting and natural fertilizers, using words far too advanced for her 8 years, but delivered with perfect understanding. Thomas had a gift for teaching that matched his mysterious abilities with the land. Elena stepped outside onto their porch, needing to feel the cool breeze that now carried the scent of growing things instead of dust and despair. Across the square, she spotted Sheriff Morrison deep in conversation with Thomas, both men gesturing toward the distant mountains. Morrison had been asking careful questions about Thomas's background, but always came away with more mysteries than answers. "Elena?" Mrs. Patterson waved from her vegetable garden, which now boasted rows of healthy green shoots. "Come see how tall my beans have grown." As Elena walked over to admire her neighbor's remarkable progress, she noticed the way people moved through town now. There was purpose in their steps, hope in their voices, and something that had been absent for too long: laughter. Children, who had grown thin and quiet during the worst of the drought, were running and playing again, their energy restored along with their parents' optimism. "Thomas says we might even have enough surplus to sell at the autumn market," Mrs. Patterson continued, her eyes bright with possibilities. "Can you imagine us with surplus crops again?" Elena could imagine it, though the transformation still felt dreamlike. 3 weeks ago they'd been preparing to abandon their homes, to join the endless stream of refugees heading east toward uncertain futures in overcrowded cities. Now they were planning for harvests and talking about improvements to the school. A commotion near the livery stable caught her attention. A group of riders was approaching, their horses dusty from hard travel. Elena's stomach tightened with familiar anxiety as she recognized the type, Desperate families fleeing their own drought-devastated lands, hoping to find what Cedar Falls had lost long ago. But instead of the bitter disappointment she'd grown accustomed to delivering to such travelers, Elena felt excitement building in her chest. They had something to offer now. More than that, they had Thomas. She watched as the drifter approached the newcomers with the same quiet compassion he'd shown Star on that first night. His gentle voice carried across the square as he spoke to the travel-weary families, and Elena saw their faces transform from despair to cautious hope as he gestured toward the flowing water and green fields. Sheriff Morrison joined her, shaking his head in amazement. 3 more families this week. Pretty soon we'll need to start building new houses. Thomas will know how, Elena said with absolute certainty, though she couldn't explain why. The mysterious man seemed to possess infinite knowledge wrapped in humble simplicity. As evening approached, bringing another day of miracles to its peaceful close, Elena offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the stranger who had saved more than just a dying horse. The dawn sky stretched pale and cloudless above Millbrook as Ezra stood at the edge of the newly flowing creek, watching the water catch the first light. 3 days had passed since the spring's miraculous emergence, and already the parched earth along the banks showed tender shoots of green breaking through the hardpan. Behind him, the sound of hammering echoed from the town square, where volunteers worked to repair the schoolhouse roof that had been damaged in the previous year's storms. The discovery of water had breathed new life into more than just the land. It had awakened hope in hearts that had nearly forgotten its taste. "Mr. Ezra," a small voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Tommy Henderson approaching, his boots still too big for his feet, but his step more confident than before. "Pa says you're thinking of moving on." Ezra crouched down to meet the boy's eyes. "Your pa's got good ears. What do you think about that?" Tommy kicked at a clod of damp earth. "I think maybe you got more places that need help, but I sure wish you'd stay." The honesty in the child's voice stirred something deep in Ezra's chest. Over the past weeks, he'd watched this community transform from a collection of desperate souls clinging to a dying dream into something resembling a real town again. The Hendersons had decided to stay, as had most of the other families. Even old Marcus Webb had started talking about expanding his general store. "Sometimes leaving is the kindest thing a person can do," Ezra said gently. "Gives folks a chance to stand on their own 2 feet. Tommy considered this with the seriousness that children brought to adult mysteries, like with Star, when you stopped doctoring her every day so she'd get strong by herself. The boy's insight surprised him. Star had indeed grown stronger once Ezra stepped back from her daily care, allowing her natural resilience to take hold. The mare now grazed freely near the creek, her coat gleaming with health, her step sure and proud. "Something like that," Ezra agreed. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Sarah Mitchell walked toward them, her medical bag in hand and purpose in her stride. Since taking over Star's care, she'd thrown herself into learning everything she could about animal healing, riding out to the Jameson Ranch twice a week to help with their livestock. "Morning, Ezra. Tommy." She nodded to both of them before fixing her gaze on the drifter. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about setting up a proper clinic, about doing more than just treating symptoms." Sarah set down her bag and gestured toward the flowing creek. "This water isn't just fixing our drought problem. It's showing us what's possible when we look deeper, think bigger." Ezra straightened, sensing the passion building in her words. "Go on. I want to establish a teaching clinic. Bring in students from back east, train them in frontier medicine, show them how to work with limited resources, how to see connections between human health and the land itself." Her eyes shone with the fervor of a true believer. Millbrook could become a center for learning, not just another dying town. Tommy looked between them, trying to follow the conversation. "Would that mean more people coming here?" "Good people," Sarah assured him. "People who want to help others, like your friend Ezra here." The comparison made Ezra uncomfortable. He'd never seen himself as particularly good, just a man trying to make amends for past mistakes. But watching Sarah's vision take shape, seeing the spark of possibility in young Tommy's eyes, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction of planting seeds in fertile ground. "You'll need funding," he said practically. "Equipment, support from the territorial government." "I know, but I also know this community now. We've learned how to make miracles happen with next to nothing." Sarah's smile carried the confidence of someone who'd already moved mountains. "Besides, we've got something most places don't." "What's that?" "A reputation for impossible things." She gestured toward Star, who had wandered closer and now stood watching them with intelligent eyes. Words already spreading about the horse that came back from death's door and the spring that appeared overnight. People are curious about Millbrook again. Ezra felt the familiar restlessness stirring in his chest, the urge to move on before folks started asking too many questions about his past. But he also felt something else, a reluctance to leave this particular story unfinished. "How long do you think it would take," he asked, "to get something like that started?" Sarah's eyes widened with surprise and hope. "You'd stay? Maybe a little longer. Help with the foundation work." Tommy let out a whoop of joy that sent Star trotting over to investigate. The mare nuzzled the boy's shoulder before turning her attention to Ezra, her dark eyes holding what looked suspiciously like approval. Some roots, Ezra thought, as he reached up to stroke the horse's neck, grew deeper than a man realized until he tried to pull them up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed landscape as Samuel stood at the edge of what had once been barren earth. Green shoots pushed through the dark soil, reaching toward the light with an urgency that spoke of life too long denied. The irrigation channels he and the townspeople had carved over the past weeks sparkled with clear water, fed by the spring that had emerged where Esperanza first drank from his cupped hands. "Still can't believe it," muttered Jake Morrison, approaching with a coffee cup steaming in the cool dawn air. The banker's pristine suits had given way to work clothes, his soft hands now calloused from wielding shovel and pickaxe. "3 weeks ago, I was foreclosing on half these properties. Now look at it." Samuel accepted the offered cup, inhaling the rich aroma. Real coffee had returned to Salvation Creek along with hope and prosperity. Ground has a way of surprising folks when you give it what it needs. "That all this is? Surprised ground?" Jake's voice carried a note of something between skepticism and wonder. "Because I've been talking to some of the old-timers. They remember stories about this land, about water that used to flow here before the mines came through." The drifter sipped his coffee, watching as Martha Henley emerged from a boarding house to tend the vegetable garden that had sprouted behind the building. Her movements were brisk and purposeful, a stark contrast to the defeated shuffle she'd carried just weeks before. Sometimes what we think is lost is just waiting for the right moment to come back. But the timing, Samuel, the way that spring opened up right after Esperanza drank, it's like she knew something we didn't. Maybe she did. Samuel's weathered fingers traced the rim of his cup. "Horses got senses we don't understand. They can feel water running deep underground, sense storms days before they hit. Could be she was drawn to that spot for reasons we'll never know." The sound of children's laughter drifted from the schoolhouse where Elena Rodriguez was teaching again. The teacher had returned from her sister's place in Santa Fe when news of the town's revival reached her. Her classroom, once empty and silent, now buzzed with the voices of children whose families had come back or never left, sustained by the miracle that had given Salvation Creek new life. "You ever going to tell us who you really are?" Jake's question came quietly, without accusation. "I mean, a man doesn't just wander into a dying town and change everything without having some kind of past." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching as Tom Bradley led a string of healthy horses toward the newly green pastures. The veterinarian had thrown himself into caring for the animals with renewed vigor, as if Esperanza's recovery had restored something in him as well. "We all got pasts, Jake. Question is whether they define us or we define ourselves. That's not really an answer. It's the only one I got." A commotion near the main street drew their attention. Doc Wilson's wagon was pulling up in front of his clinic, loaded with medical supplies that Jake's newfound financial flexibility had made possible. The old physician moved with energy that belied his years, calling out instructions to his assistant about where to store the medicines. "You saved more than a horse," Jake said, his voice thoughtful. "You saved all of us. Horse saved herself. I just gave her some water." "Come on, Samuel. You had to know what would happen. The way you insisted we stay, the way you seemed so certain things would work out. You knew about that spring." Samuel turned to meet the banker's gaze directly. "What I knew was that this town was worth saving, that the people here had something good worth fighting for. Sometimes that's all the knowledge a man needs." A distant whinny drew their attention to the pasture where Esperanza grazed contentedly among the other horses. Her coat gleamed with health, her movements strong and sure. She raised her head as if sensing their observation, her dark eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been gratitude. "She's something special, that one," Jake observed. "All God's creatures are special if you look close enough, but some are more special than others." Samuel finished his coffee and handed the empty cup back to Jake. "I reckon I'll be moving on soon. Town's got what it needs now. You folks can take it from here." The banker's expression shifted to concern. "Moving on? But why? You've got a place here now. We all want you to stay." "Staying's not in my nature, Jake. Besides, there's other places, other folks who could use some help." As if summoned by their conversation, Esperanza lifted her head again and began walking toward them, her hoofbeats soft on the new grass. Samuel smiled, recognizing something in her approach that Jake couldn't see. Some conversations were meant to be had without words, and this was one of them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed landscape as Elena walked among the thriving gardens that had once been barren dust. 3 weeks had passed since the revelation about Marcus and the spring, and Clearwater had become something none of them could have imagined. Where desperate people had once fought over every drop of water, neighbors now worked side by side, their hands dark with rich soil. She paused beside the schoolhouse, where Sarah Chen had established what she called the learning garden, teaching children how to identify plants, understand water cycles, and recognize the delicate balance that sustained life. The sound of young laughter drifted through the morning air, a sound that had been absent from the town for too long. Hard to believe, isn't it? Elena turned to find Doc Morrison approaching, his medical bag replaced with a worn basket filled with herbs he'd been collecting. The transformation in him was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The bitter cynicism that had consumed him seemed to have evaporated like morning dew. "Which part?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the bustling activity around them. "That we nearly destroyed ourselves over something we already had, or that it took a stranger to show us how to see it?" "Both, I suppose." Morrison knelt beside a patch of wild sage, examining its leaves with careful attention. "Sarah's been teaching me about medicinal plants. Amazing what grows here naturally if you know how to look." He glanced up at her. "Speaking of which, have you seen Marcus this morning?" Elena shook her head, though she wasn't surprised by the question. Marcus had become increasingly solitary as the town flourished, often disappearing for hours at a time. She'd noticed him watching the celebrations and community gatherings from a distance, as if afraid to fully participate in what he'd helped create. "He's been spending time at the old mine," she said. "I think he feels responsible for what happened before, with his father, the mining company, all of it." Morrison straightened, his expression thoughtful. "Guilt's a heavy burden to carry, especially when it belongs to someone else's choices." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Elena looked up to see Sheriff Bradley riding hard toward the town center, his face grim. Behind him rode 2 men she didn't recognize, their clothes dusty from hard travel. "Elena!" Bradley called out as he dismounted. "Where's Marcus?" Something in his tone made her stomach tighten. "What's wrong?" One of the strangers stepped forward, a weathered man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Walsh from Riverside County. We're looking for a man named Marcus Donovan. He's wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Thomas Donovan and the destruction of mining property. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Around them, the bustling activity of the morning began to slow as people noticed the tension. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "Marcus was 12 years old when his father died. He's done nothing wrong." "New evidence has come to light," Walsh continued, his voice official and cold. "Testimony from a former mining company supervisor suggests the boy may have tampered with equipment the night before the accident. We need to bring him in." "After 20 years?" Doc Morrison stepped forward, his voice sharp with anger. "What kind of evidence could possibly—" "The kind that involves a substantial reward," Walsh interrupted. "The Consolidated Mining Company is offering $5,000 for information leading to the arrest of anyone connected to the sabotage of their operation." Elena's mind raced. The mining company, or what remained of it, had somehow learned about Marcus's presence in Clearwater. Perhaps they'd heard about the spring, about the town's remarkable recovery, and decided to investigate. Or perhaps someone had simply recognized his name and decided $5,000 was worth destroying a man's life. "You won't find him," she said quietly. Walsh's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, harboring a fugitive is a serious crime." "I'm not harboring anyone. Marcus Donovan left town 3 days ago. The lie came easily, born from a fierce protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. He said something about heading north to Montana." Bradley studied her face carefully, then nodded. "That's right. I saw him leave myself, seemed restless after all the excitement died down." The deputy looked skeptical, but without evidence to the contrary, he had little choice but to accept their story. "If he returns, we expect to be notified immediately. This matter isn't closed." As the men remounted and rode away, Elena felt the weight of the community's trust settling on her shoulders. She had bought Marcus time, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Somewhere in the hills surrounding their transformed town, a good man was about to become a hunted fugitive. The miracle of Clearwater had come with a price none of them had anticipated, and Elena realized their greatest test wasn't surviving the drought. It was protecting the man who had saved them all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed valley as Elena stood beside the expanded well, watching the clear water bubble up from depths that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the schoolhouse where classes had resumed, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from Martha's bakery. Life had returned to Millhaven, but with it came a restlessness that Elena couldn't shake. She found Caleb near the edge of town, checking the shoes on his horse with practiced efficiency. The sight made her heart sink, though she'd been expecting this moment since the rains had come and the crisis had passed. "You're leaving," she said, not bothering to make it a question. His hands stilled on the horse's hoof. "Soon, the town needs you. I need you." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest in the morning air. Caleb straightened slowly, his weathered face etched with something between pain and resolve. "Elena, what I told you about my past, about the water finding, that's not the whole truth." She felt a chill despite the warming sun. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the well, toward the green shoots beginning to emerge in previously barren fields. "This gift, it comes with a price. Every time I use it, every time I reach deep into the earth and call the water up, it takes something from me, and from the place I leave behind. That's impossible. Look around. Everything is thriving. For now." His voice was barely above a whisper. "But I've seen what happens when I stay too long. The balance shifts. The water that comes so easily at first becomes harder to reach, and eventually it stops coming at all." Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You're telling me you're some kind of curse?" "I don't know what I am." He ran a hand through his graying hair. "I only know the pattern. I arrive when water is needed most desperately. I find it, help it flow, watch a place come back to life. But if I stay, if I let myself believe I can build something permanent, The gift turns on itself. How many times? The question escaped before she could consider whether she wanted the answer. 7 towns, 7 communities I've watched flourish and then begin to wither when I stayed too long. His eyes met hers, and she saw decades of accumulated loss there. I won't let that happen to Millhaven. I won't let it happen to you. Elena felt her world tilting. Everything she thought she understood about this man, about what they built together, suddenly seemed as fragile as morning dew. What if you're wrong? What if this time is different? And if I'm not wrong? If I stay and watch the well run dry again? If I watch the children's laughter fade and the hope drain from your eyes? He shook his head firmly. I can't take that risk. A commotion from the town centre interrupted them, voices raised in excitement, people calling out to each other. Elena and Caleb hurried toward the sound, finding a crowd gathered around a stranger on horseback. A man with a badge pinned to his dust-covered coat. Name's Marshall Davidson, the man was announcing, looking for information about a fellow named Caleb Morrison. Word spread about what happened here, about the water miracle. Got some people real interested in talking to him. Elena felt Caleb tense beside her. Tom stepped forward from the crowd. What kind of people? Government types, mostly. Scientists who want to study how he does what he does. Land speculators who see opportunity. The marshal's eyes swept the crowd. Course, there's others too. Folks from places where the water's gone dry, desperate enough to do whatever it takes to bring him to their towns. He's helped us, Martha called out. Why can't you just leave him be? The marshal shrugged. Man's got a gift that could change everything. In times like these, that makes him valuable, and valuable things don't get to hide for long. Elena looked around at the faces of her neighbors. People who had come to see Caleb as their savior, their good fortune made manifest. She could see the protective instincts warring with the dawning realization of what harboring him might cost them. Caleb stepped forward, his decision written clearly in his posture. Marshal, I'm not here, Elena interrupted, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. The man you're looking for moved on weeks ago. We haven't seen him since. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tom nodded gravely. That's right. Fellow helped us with some drilling techniques and moved on. Can't say where he headed. The marshal's eyes narrowed, clearly skeptical, but faced with the united front of the entire town, he had little choice but to accept their story. Well, if he does come back through, you'll want to send word. Like I said, he's got friends who'd very much like to meet him. As the marshal rode away, Elena turned to find Caleb staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why? He asked simply. Elena looked around at her community, imperfect, stubborn, but hers, then back at the man who had given them hope. Because some miracles are worth protecting. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street as Jakob stood before the assembled townspeople, his weathered hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. The dying mare, now strong enough to stand, nickered softly behind him as if sensing the gravity of the moment. 40 years ago, Jakob began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, I rode through here as a young man. This town was different then, green, prosperous, full of life. The river ran clear and strong, and the fields stretched emerald to the horizon. Sarah stepped closer, her reporter's instincts sharp. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't just reminiscence. I met a girl here, Jakob continued, his eyes finding Mayor Henderson in the crowd. Beautiful as summer rain, with eyes that held all the hope in the world. We fell in love, planned to marry, build a life together. His voice caught slightly. Her name was Catherine. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Henderson's face had gone pale, his hands clenched at his sides. But I was young and foolish, Jakob said. When gold was discovered up north, I convinced myself I needed to make my fortune first to be worthy of her. I promised to return within a year, wealthy enough to give her everything she deserved. The wind picked up, stirring dust devils in the street. Jakob's eyes never left Henderson's face. The gold rush was a bust. Took me 2 years just to earn enough for the journey home. When I finally returned—" He paused, the pain still fresh after all these decades. Catherine had married someone else, a man who could provide stability, security. She was pregnant with their first child. Dr. Martinez moved closer to Henderson, whose breathing had become labored. "I was heartbroken, angry," Jacob admitted. "In my hurt, I did something unforgivable. Before I left town, I went to the old mine shaft up in the hills, the one that fed the underground spring. There'd been a cave-in that partially blocked it. Instead of reporting it so it could be cleared, His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I made it worse. Moved rocks, caused another collapse. I told myself it would be a problem for another generation, that it was fitting this place should suffer as I had suffered." The crowd erupted in shocked voices, but Henderson stepped forward, his face etched with a mixture of anger and something else. Understanding. "You killed my town," Henderson said, his voice raw. "My family's legacy, destroyed because of your broken heart." "Yes," Jacob said simply, "and I've carried that guilt every day since. When I heard about the drought, about how bad things had gotten here, I knew I had to come back. Had to try to make it right." "The water samples," Dr. Martinez said suddenly, understanding dawning in her voice. "You didn't just know what was wrong with the water supply. You knew because you caused it." Jacob nodded heavily. "The blockage I created has been slowly poisoning the underground spring for decades, getting worse each year. The drought just made it critical." Sarah's mind raced, putting pieces together. "That's why you were so insistent about helping the mayor. It wasn't just kindness. It was penance." "Everything I've done since arriving has been penance," Jacob confirmed. "The horse, the well, trying to bring you all together. I can't undo 40 years of damage, but I can try to heal what I broke." Henderson stood silent for a long moment, his whole body trembling with emotion. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with tears. "Catherine was my mother," he said. "She died when I was 15, but she never stopped talking about you. About the young man who broke her heart but whom she never stopped loving. She named me after you, Jacob Henderson. I've been living in the shadow of a ghost my whole life." The revelation hit Jacob like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his face ashen. "You're her son," Henderson confirmed. "And you're the reason she lived her whole life in a dying town, watching everything she loved wither away." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across 40 years of pain and misunderstanding. Then Jacob reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather portfolio thick with papers. "The mining rights to the upper hills," he said, holding them out. "I bought them years ago, been sitting on them ever since. They're yours now, and I know exactly how to clear the blockage I created. It'll take work, but the spring can flow clean again." Henderson looked at the papers, then at the man who had shaped his entire life from the shadows. "Why now?" he asked. "After all this time, why come back?" Jacob's eyes moved to the mayor, then to the faces of the townspeople around them. "Because some mistakes take a lifetime to understand," he said quietly. "And some debts can only be paid with everything you have left to give." The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed valley as Marcus stood beside the old well, watching the last of the water equipment being loaded onto wagons. 3 weeks had passed since the aquifer breakthrough, and Clearwater had become something none of them could have imagined, a thriving hub of activity with folks arriving daily to witness what they were calling the miracle of the desert. But miracles, Marcus had learned, came with their own complications. "Another delegation from the territorial capital arrived this morning," Sheriff Wade said, approaching with a coffee cup steaming in the cool air. "That makes 5 different government groups wanting to study our geological phenomenon." Marcus nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around his own cup. "And what did you tell them?" "Same thing I told the others, that we're a small town managing our own affairs just fine." Wade's expression grew serious. "But they're getting pushier, Marcus. Word spread too far now. Some are talking about federal oversight, water rights claims from neighboring counties." Through the bustle of morning activity, Marcus spotted Elena directing a group of workers near the schoolhouse, which had doubled in size to accommodate the children of new families. Her laughter carried on the breeze, and he felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the knowledge that his time here was drawing to a close. "You thinking of moving on?" Wade said. It wasn't a question. "Been thinking about it. People here won't like that. You've become something of a legend." Marcus almost smiled. "Legends are just stories folks tell to make sense of things they can't explain. This town doesn't need a legend. It needs what it's got. Good people willing to work together." A commotion near the main street drew their attention. Two men in expensive suits were arguing with Tom Brennan outside the general store, their voices raised and gestures animated. Marcus recognized the type: speculators, government men, the kind who appeared whenever something valuable was discovered. "Trouble?" Marcus asked. "The kind that follows money and opportunity," Wade replied grimly. "They're claiming the water discovery gives them grounds to reassess property values, maybe relocate some families for optimal resource management." Marcus set down his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. This was what he'd feared, what always happened when outside attention focused on places like Clearwater. The very thing that had saved the town might now destroy its spirit. They walked toward the commotion, arriving as Elena emerged from the schoolhouse with several other townspeople. The suit-wearing men had multiplied. There were 4 now, with official-looking documents and measuring equipment. "Gentlemen," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. "Something I can help you with?" The lead man, thin and sharp-featured with calculating eyes, looked Marcus up and down dismissively. "You would be the drifter, I assume. Marcus something or other. We're here on territorial business regarding the water rights and land assessment. Nothing that concerns a transient." The word transient hung in the air like a slap. Marcus felt the townspeople behind him tense, saw Elena step forward with fire in her eyes. "This man is more citizen of this town than you'll ever be," she said sharply. "And if you think you can waltz in here and—" "Elena." Marcus's gentle voice stopped her. He stepped closer to the official, and something in his bearing, a quiet authority born of years and experience, made the man unconsciously take a step back. "I've been a lot of things," Marcus said conversationally. "Drifter, ranch hand, prospector. But I've also been a territorial surveyor back when this land was first being mapped and claimed. Spent 5 years documenting water rights through this whole region." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Fascinating thing about those old surveys, they're still legally binding. And I happen to remember this particular area very well. The official's confidence wavered. That would be a matter of public record, if such surveys exist." "Oh, they exist." Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded yellow document. "Along with my certification as a federal land assessor, still valid as it happens." He handed the paper to the man, who unfolded it with trembling fingers. The silence stretched as the official read, his face growing pale. Finally, he looked up, cleared his throat, and gestured to his companions. "It appears there may be some jurisdictional complexities we weren't aware of. We'll need to return to the capital for consultation." Within minutes, the officials were loading their equipment and departing, leaving the townspeople standing in amazed silence. "Territorial surveyor?" Elena asked, wonder and something else, hurt, in her voice. "In all this time you never saw the need," Marcus replied simply. "Until now." But even as the immediate threat receded, Marcus knew others would follow. The secret was out, the isolation broken. Clearwater would survive and prosper, but it would also change in ways that couldn't be stopped. And perhaps it was time for him to change as well. The morning sun cast long shadows across the transformed landscape as Sarah stood at the edge of what had once been a barren field. Green shoots pushed through dark, fertile soil, their tender leaves catching dewdrops that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The sight still took her breath away, even 3 weeks after the miracle had begun. "Hard to believe, isn't it?" She turned to find Marcus approaching, his weathered face creased with wonder rather than the worry lines she'd grown accustomed to seeing. In his hands, he carried a wooden bucket brimming with clear water from the well that had saved them all. "Every morning I wake up thinking it was just a dream," Sarah admitted, kneeling to touch one of the sprouting plants. "Then I come out here and see this." The transformation hadn't been instant, despite the dramatic appearance of the spring. It had taken days of careful irrigation, of nursing the parched earth back to life with the precious water that flowed endlessly from beneath the dying oak. The townspeople had worked together with a unity born of shared desperation and newfound hope, dividing the labor and the water with meticulous fairness. "Where is he this morning?" Marcus asked, though they both knew the answer. Sarah gestured toward the rise beyond the fields, where a solitary figure sat beside a simple wooden cross. The drifter had carved it himself from fallen timber, marking the spot where the old mare lay buried. Every dawn found him there, hat in hand, paying his respects to the creature whose death had somehow awakened life itself. They watched him in comfortable silence, this man who had given them everything while asking for nothing in return. The town council had offered him land, money, a permanent place among them, but he'd quietly declined each gesture. He remained what he'd always been, a traveler who'd simply paused in his journey to help where help was needed. "The children have been asking about him," Marcus said. "Little Emma wants to know if he's really leaving." Sarah's heart clenched. They all knew this day would come, had seen it in the way the drifter had begun checking his meager belongings and the careful attention he paid to his horse's gear. Paradise Creek was healing, the crisis past, and men like him didn't stay where they weren't needed. "He never promised to remain," she said softly. "He gave us what we needed most, hope and water. Maybe that was always meant to be enough." As if sensing their attention, the drifter rose from his vigil and made his way down the slope. His movements held the same unhurried grace they'd first witnessed, but something had changed in him too. The hard edges of isolation had softened, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. "Morning," he said simply as he approached, settling his hat back onto his head. "The eastern fields are showing strong growth," Marcus reported, falling into step beside him as they walked toward town. "Another week and we'll have enough grazing to support the livestock properly." The drifter nodded, genuine satisfaction in his expression. "Good. The root systems will help prevent future erosion too." They emerged onto Main Street, where the transformation was equally remarkable. Shop fronts that had stood shuttered now displayed goods again. Children played in the dust instead of huddling in whatever shade they could find. The sound of hammers rang out as families began repairing and expanding homes they'd been preparing to abandon. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the general store, her face lighting up when she spotted them. "Perfect timing. I've got your provisions ready." The drifter's step faltered slightly. "Ma'am, I didn't order any—" "Nonsense," she interrupted briskly. "You think we'd let you ride out of here empty-handed? There's jerked beef, hardtack, coffee and beans, enough for 2 weeks at least." Before he could protest further, Tom appeared with his horse, freshly groomed and fitted with a new bridle. "Best leather I had," the blacksmith said gruffly. "Figured you'd need reliable gear for whatever road you're taking next." One by one, the townspeople gathered. Dr. Mills with a medical kit for emergencies, the baker with fresh bread wrapped in cloth, families with small gifts, a hand-carved comb, socks knitted from precious yarn, a pocket Bible with worn pages. The drifter stood in the center of it all, clearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of gratitude. Sarah watched his throat work as he struggled for words that seemed inadequate for the moment. "You don't owe me anything," he finally managed. "We know," Sarah replied, speaking for them all. "That's exactly why we want to give it." Pastor Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Would you allow us to offer a blessing for your journey?" The drifter looked around at the circle of faces, people who'd been strangers just a month ago, now bound together by shared trials and unexpected grace. Slowly he removed his hat and bowed his head. As the pastor's words rose toward the brightening sky, Sarah felt the weight of endings and beginnings, of gratitude too large for words. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millhaven as Samuel packed his worn saddlebags with deliberate care. The town had awakened differently today. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard where Miss Ellen was already teaching beneath the shade of newly planted saplings, and the sound of hammers rang out from 3 separate construction sites where families were building new homes. Clara stood in the doorway of the general store. Watching him prepare to leave, the past weeks had transformed her as much as they had the town. The worry lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by something that looked remarkably like hope. She approached him slowly, carrying a cloth bundle. "You'll need food for the journey," she said, though they both knew it wasn't really about the provisions. Samuel accepted the bundle, his calloused fingers brushing hers briefly. "The town doesn't need me anymore, Clara. It never really did." "Maybe not the town," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what about the people in it?" Before he could respond, young Tommy came running around the corner of the blacksmith shop, his face flushed with excitement and something that looked like panic. Behind him, Dr. Whitmore followed at a more measured pace, though his expression carried the same urgency. "Samuel!" Tommy called out, skidding to a stop beside Bella, who nickered softly at the boy's approach. "You can't leave yet. There's something you need to see." Dr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. A gesture Samuel had learned meant the older man was processing something significant. "We've been analyzing the water samples from the new spring," he said. "The mineral content is unlike anything I've seen in 40 years of practice." Samuel continued securing his bedroll, though his movements slowed. "Water's water, Doc." "Not this water." Whitmore pulled a small glass vial from his vest pocket. "The mineral composition suggests this spring connects to an underground river system that could extend for hundreds of miles. If I'm right, Millhaven isn't just sitting on a single water source. It's positioned above one of the largest aquifers in the territory." The implications settled over them like dust after a windstorm. Clara's hand went to her throat. "You mean there's enough water for irrigation systems that could transform this entire region," Dr. Whitmore finished. "For communities that could support thousands instead of hundreds. For an agricultural center that could feed settlements from here to the Colorado River." Samuel finally looked up from his packing. The weight of the revelation pressed against something deep in his chest, a longing he'd spent years trying to bury. For most of his adult life, he'd moved from place to place, carrying his skills and his secrets like stones in his pockets, always arriving, always leaving, never quite belonging anywhere. "That's a big responsibility," he said quietly. Mayor Henderson emerged from the crowd that had begun to gather, his face bearing an expression Samuel had never seen before. Genuine respect mixed with something that might have been pleading. "We're going to need someone who understands water rights, someone who can negotiate with the territorial government, someone who knows how to build something lasting." "You're talking about staying," Samuel said. It wasn't a question. Tommy stepped forward, his young face earnest and determined. "Bella's got the best grazing land she's ever had, and the other horses listen to her now. They trust her because she survived something terrible and came back stronger." The boy's words hung in the air like a challenge and a promise. Samuel looked at Bella, whose coat now gleamed with health, whose eyes held the calm confidence of a creature that had found her home. She regarded him with the patient wisdom that only horses possessed, as if she understood exactly what choice he was facing. Clara moved closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Sometimes the greatest adventure isn't about where you're going," she said. "Sometimes it's about what you choose to build where you are." The sounds of the town continued around them. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels, the distant lowing of cattle, but underneath it all Samuel could hear something new, the sound of a community that had discovered its own strength, its own capacity for growth and change. He untied his saddlebags from Bella's back and let them fall to the ground. "I suppose we'll need to survey the land properly," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Map the water table, plan the irrigation channels, maybe even design a proper town square." Tommy whooped with joy, and Dr. Whitmore smiled broadly. Mayor Henderson extended his hand for a firm shake. But it was Clara's smile that settled the matter completely. Brilliant and warm as the sunrise over their drought-broken land, full of promise for all the mornings yet to come. Samuel had spent his life following rivers. Now, finally, he would help one flow exactly where it was meant to be.